It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
It's an unfortunate truth that most Americans have been sheltered from global realities for so long that the vast majority are now completely disconnected from those realities. This orchestrated paradigm cannot be maintained for much longer. The power structure knows this. The walls are closing in from every side. In this installment of Global Alert News, I'll try my best to cover the latest and most critical headlines that pose the greatest threat to our collective futures. This is Dane Wigington. You're listening to the Global Alert News Hour for May 5th, 2018. This is a commercial-free program brought to you by geoinženjeringwatch.org. It's broadcast throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7. From ZeroHedge.com and other sources, here's another headline. Bill Gates warns millions could die if U.S. doesn't prepare for coming pandemic. All of this goes together in one form or another when we have these types of warning coming from those who are certainly part of the inner circle, or they wouldn't be in the position they're in. They would never get there if they weren't part of the inner circle. So, and I'll get to other warnings in a moment that connect with this regarding 9/11 and that implicate people like Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. Warnings that were far too specific to be accidents. So this warning, new from Bill Gates: should a deadly pandemic comparable to the 1918 influenza outbreak reach the U.S. in the near future, the U.S. government would be powerless to stop it, and in all likelihood, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans will die. That's the message from a Washington Post interview with Microsoft founder Bill Gates, which touched on many of the same subjects from a talk he gave a week ago Friday before the Massachusetts Medical Society. Gates went on to say that there is a significant probability, not possibility, probability, of a large and lethal modern-day pandemic occurring in our lifetimes. According to Gates, Trump told him to raise these issues with officials at the Health and Human Services Department, the National Institutes of Health, and the Food and Drug Administration. Gates said he also met with H.R. McMaster, who was ousted as National Security Advisor last month, and he hopes to meet with McMaster's successor, John Bolton. John Bolton, who should be incarcerated for a long list of what can only be considered state-sponsored terrorism, war crimes. If you don't know anything about John Bolton, you need to know. And if that's the way Mr. Trump is draining the swamp, something's very wrong. And he's the tip of the iceberg, Mr. Bolton is. The swamp is not being drained. It's being filled. And all the theater from all sides of the fence, the criminal mainstream media attacks on Trump and Trump himself, all of it, it's all part of the theater to distract us from the fact that the biosphere is imploding around us. And remember what I stated earlier in this program. We talk about the pandemic that Mr. Gates seems to know is going to come and that Mr. Trump told him to tell the agencies about. We have an aerosol spraying operation globally that's going on over our heads every single day. At any point in time, they choose to make something like this happen. They can make it happen. And as I've covered in previous programs with former government scientist Ken Caldera, now professor at Stanford, stating what he did for the government was to design pathogens to seed into clouds to infect the populations below. Connect the dots. When it can't be hidden from the population any longer, do you think that they wouldn't resort to this? Think again. We look at what the U.S. military has done and what's not reported here. The list of what can only be considered war crimes is unimaginably extensive, as I've covered in previous broadcasts. The nearly 100 countries that our military has invaded and or occupied in the last 100 plus years. If we look at the amount of what can only be considered war crimes that our country has committed, and not that it's just our country. Again, I'm not stating that. Please dump the dichotomous thinking. The atrocities that have gone on in Russia, China, Middle Eastern countries, other countries that are our allies, like Saudi Arabia, who, as I've stated many times, even earlier this year, beheaded dissenters, or last year, beheaded about 40 dissenters, hung them from cranes, total disregard for human rights. but they're our allies, so everything gets overlooked. So no one's innocent in this equation. But Americans have been convinced that we're the exception. American exceptionalism. What a total delusion that is. Total delusion. And the corruption and the criminality is in direct proportion to the extent of power. Where is most of the power held? With the military that's bigger than the next 10 militaries combined. That's the fact of the matter. And now we have, thankfully, more and more speaking out, like the Navy veteran whose quote I highlighted at the beginning of this broadcast, that he had to leave the military because he was finally forced to face the conclusion that you cannot serve such an entity and retain your honor. You can't do it. Not when that entity is doing what it's doing all over the globe and pretending that it's all about freedom and democracy, which could not be further from the truth. And as I try to connect all these dots again and again so that it hopefully will become clearer to more people, that the biosphere collapse is connected with power structure desperation, which is connected to events like 9/11, which is connected to the destabilization and occupation of countries with resources like all those in the Middle East, which is connected to the increased oppression of U.S. populations and other populations, a population which could, if it was fully awakened and looking through a clear lens, could alter the equation, even at this late date. So, as all of these factors come into play, we are pushing toward global conflict, as I've stated again and again. On that note, here's a headline. U.S. officials say Israel preparing for world war with Iran, seeking U.S. support. How long has that been going on? Not that there was much doubt who was behind it, but 2 days after the enemy warplanes attacked Syrian military base last Sunday, killing at least 11 Iranians and dozens of others, nobody had yet claimed responsibility for the attack. U.S. officials told NBC that it was indeed Israeli F-15 fighter jets. Bear with me. This is going somewhere that's very important and very dire. Ominously, the officials said Israel appears to be preparing for open warfare with Iran and seeking U.S. help and support. That's always been the case for them for over 2 decades. On the list of potentials for the most likely live hostility around the world, the battle between Israel and Iran in Syria is at the top of the list right now, said one senior U.S. official. The push for global conflict to topple countries with resources, countries that were named immediately after 9/11, that were targets a week after 9/11, as I've been over in many previous broadcasts, stated on the record by General Wesley Clark. Let's consider on that point, 19 months before the 9/11 attacks, Mr. Trump said this, quote, I really am convinced we're in danger of the sort of terror attacks that will make the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center look like kids playing with firecrackers. Trump went on to predict the attacks would be carried out by Osama bin Laden. How would Mr. Trump know that that would be the official narrative so far in advance? Please don't believe me. Look it up for yourself. And for those that think I'm focusing on Mr. Trump, who's only a puppet in the play, like Obama, like Clinton's, like the Bushes, all criminals, all of them criminals. I'm simply focusing on who's occupying the White House right now and facts that are relevant to that. Next, it's no secret that Mr. Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are close friends and have been for a very long time. Both of them have said so on the record. Now, listen closely to the audio I'm about to play. This is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
So I wrote a book in 1995, and I said that if the West doesn't wake up to the suicidal nature of militant Islam, the next thing you'll see is the militant Islamists bringing down the World Trade Center.
Where am I going with this? Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, has been pushing the U.S. toward wars of aggression in the Middle East for 2 decades. Netanyahu's last theatrical propaganda presentation pushing for global conflict was rolled out last Monday, which he has done before, when the U.S. isn't dropping bombs fast enough for his taste. We all have an obligation to face facts. How many have the courage to honestly examine the unvarnished truth? How many? So let's consider this from the audio I just played, where Mr. Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, admits that 6 full years before the 9/11 false flag attacks happened, war hawk Benjamin Netanyahu not only predicted massive terrorist attacks would come, he somehow knew the exact buildings that would be attacked, the World Trade Center. How is it possible he knew? And now consider that almost 3,000 of the world's top architects and engineers have stated on the record that controlled demolitions brought down the World Trade Center buildings. All 3 of them, not just Towers 1 and 2, as so many Americans believe was the case, but also Building 7, a 47-story steel structure, high-rise building, never got hit by any aircraft, never got hit by anything, and somehow collapsed at free fall speed in 7 seconds, imploding in the center exactly as we would expect a controlled demolition to be. 3,000 architects and engineers have proven with lab testing that thermite, the demolition material, incendiary thermite, was in the wreckage. And yet we have Americans who refuse to even look at the data. The blind patriotism of waving their flag, refusing to face the fact that we are swimming in a sea of lies, deception, criminality, and tyranny. And I know people even from New York, the most tenacious flag wavers there apparently, I am told by someone I know who lives in New York, will not tolerate anyone questioning the official narrative on 9/11. Is that patriotism? That's willful blindness. And we have a country full of people that are willfully blind. I challenge anyone to go online and view the Building 7 collapse, which you can see online, and try to convince yourself that that wasn't a controlled demolition. Building 7 that never got hit by anything, that didn't get addressed at all in the 9/11 report, not a single sentence. Why? Because it cannot be explained and fit into the official narrative. Can't be explained. Never got hit by anything, fell in 7 seconds, and there was a lot to hide in Building 7. Crimes of the government, Enron, other factors. There's a lot of dots that connect. I don't have time to go into that all here. But when we look back and what Mr. Netanyahu apparently knew years in advance, Mr. Netanyahu that has always wanted the U.S. to lay waste to the Middle East, has always wanted that. And yet we have people in the U.S. that worship Israel as if they can do no wrong. And we have, thankfully, and I'm very grateful to them, organizations like Jews Against Zionism, and the pilots, Israeli pilots, which I've mentioned in the past, incredibly honorable individuals that refuse to fly and bomb innocent civilians. And it would be an honor for me to shake the hand of these Israeli pilots, an absolute honor. If I ever had the opportunity to do so, I would be very grateful. We have people in Israel trying to stand up to the actions of their government, and we need more people in the U.S. standing up to the actions of our government. Total criminality, pushing toward World War III in the desperate attempt, as the biosphere collapses, to maintain their hegemonic power, to fuel their completely out-of-control militaries. We're talking about psychopathic people who, as I've stated in many previous programs, the common thread with various forms of psychosis, like psychopathic behavior, is a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. On the current course, our planet will not support life much longer. And instead of focusing on that, what are the governments of these 2 countries especially, not that other countries are innocent, they're not, but in this case, the U.S. and Israel are considered, as I outlined in a previous broadcast, They're considered by other global populations to be the greatest threat to global stability. Why? For good reason. And I'm outlining some of those reasons now. And again, back to the World Trade Centers. Building 7, not hit by a jet aircraft. And let's remember that 9/11 was the catalyzing event that successfully galvanized the U.S. population into giving a license to the Western military-industrial complex to wage wars of aggression and resource acquisition in the Middle East, just as Benjamin Netanyahu has always wanted. And though many Middle Eastern countries have already been toppled, with Western power structure serving puppet governments now installed, who are the holdouts? Syria and Iran. Who's being targeted now? Syria and Iran. Is Iran really a threat? A country that has not invaded any other country for well over 200 years? Or is the real threat to global stability the completely out of control Western military-industrial complex that continues a running list of countries who are demonized, destabilized, and toppled, occupied, and then plundered and pillaged for their resources? And all the while, the majority of the U.S. population is all too willing to look the other way, as long as their personal paradigm is not disturbed. All the while, our own government continues to spray our skies with highly toxic climate engineering elements, contaminating every breath we take. And now back to what I stated at the beginning of this program. If I seem angry, yes. Why shouldn't I be? What rational person would not be? To be clear, it's not just those in power that we should fear. It's the willfully complacent and willfully blind populations without whose support those in power could not do what they do. That's the fact of the matter. This reminder again, as the biosphere implodes, the power structure desperation goes exponential, creating global conflict is their final option. All of these dots connect. Every subject I covered in this broadcast and others all connect. Those who have the courage to face reality, please take the time, make the time to view the 9/11 Architects and Engineers documentary. More information on this film can be found online under the 9/11 A&E for Truth website. Also, one more shocking video, a must-view documentary, which was just brought to my attention, by the way, titled Donald Trump 9/11 Case Closed. And for the record, this documentary is not just about Donald Trump by any stretch of the imagination. We have every administration since that event involved, and even those before it, involved in one form or another. This is just a very thorough documentary. I was impressed by it. I had not seen it before, just found it, was sent to me. I'll include the link for this documentary in the posting for this program. View the shocking facts and film footage clips in this video if you're not afraid of the truth. Those who are willing to face the truth should consider that the ongoing atmospheric spraying programs, as I stated earlier, could, at any point the power structure wishes, be used for even more toxic dispersals than what is already occurring. If you think that can't happen, think again. Think again. As I've been over in so many previous broadcasts, we knew officially that even as far back as 1997, up to that point, that there were at least 239 open-air biological tests carried out by our military against U.S. populations. If you think that those who control the military, I'm not stating all of our brothers and sisters in the military, who obviously the majority of which have honorable motives, although their motives are not enough. They're not enough. They have an obligation to stand back and look at the truth and understand what it is they're participating in. They have an obligation. But those at the top do not care what they do to populations, including the U.S. population. No question about that. Here's the bottom line. If the majority continue to hide from reality, we are doomed. If the majority continue to pretend that the converging catastrophes closing in from every side will somehow magically go away if ignored long enough, we have no chance. They are not going to go away. Solace and self-respect do not exist in denial. Only in fully facing the truth, head on, can such states of mind be found and held. Time is not on our side. We must all make our voices heard in this epic battle for the greater good. Sharing credible data is key. Make your voice heard. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.